The original Silent Hill 2 is one of the most cohesive games I've ever played. Every aspect, from the charmingly unnatural dialogue to the unresponsive control scheme, says something meaningful about James Sunderland and Silent Hill. It might sound like I'm bashing it, but I promise I'm not. These little ways that the game resists the player's understanding reflect the disorienting atmosphere of the town itself. So, how does a game like that, a game that is so deliberate in its every detail, get remade without losing what made the original so great? Personally, I think we have our answer. Silent Hill 2 Remake complements rather than supplants the original by making practical so much that was once abstract. The uncanniness of the characters in the original, for instance, is eschewed in favor of grounded, textured performances. The numbness of combat, which maintained distance between protagonist and player, is now much faster paced, but desperate and frenetic. Even though the puzzles are mostly easy, they remain one of the most important ways James interfaces with the world, a manifestation of Silent Hill's delirious illogic. For me, all of these changes meant that I felt closer to James and to this world, making the plot so much more emotionally impactful. However, I can't deny that the particular atmosphere of the original wasn't quite captured. But, does that matter? Is that fair to expect? I don't think so, especially when this remake offers such a confident reimagining. Confident because it isn't afraid to simultaneously reinterpret and call back to the original. Like I said, it doesn't set out to replace it. They reinforce each other, and coming out of the remake, I appreciate the original even more than I did after first playing it. I already said that these games are some of the most efficient, cohesive texts that I've come across in the medium, using every element at their disposal, combat, resource economy, level design, in-game dialogue, and cutscenes, to tell a strange, compelling story. They're far from the only games to ever do this, but I think they're some of the best. What I want to talk about here is how the remake uses these elements differently to tell the same story. So, let's first look at the original. Although it was undeniably made within the bounds of the technology, standards, and sensibility of its time, I think it's fair to read its choices as deliberate artistic decisions. I mean, its washed-out color palette, low poly models, and stilted dialogue. The voice actors sound so stiff and tone-deaf that they could be straight out of some kind of language education program. The character models are uncanny. There's often tension between what they express visually and what they say. That contrast is unsettling. I love that about all the classic survival horror games in general. That mix of camp and surrealness that makes the characters as strange as the setting and enemies. But there's a second side to that coin. The characters often come across as little more than caricatures. Conversations feel numb and lack nuance. I thought the game's ideas about grief, obsession, and self-reproach were really interesting, but the plot didn't impact me as much as it could have because the characters felt indefinite. So, it was interesting for me to see that although the bulk of the plot is basically identical, the characters are reimagined so sharply. They're no longer strange, not quite human creatures. They offer the player something to grasp, something to understand in this otherwise surreal and abstract world. The voice actors give more textured performances, delivering lines with deliberate intonation that lays bare the little changes in mood, understated moments of uncertainty, misdirected anger, and desperation. Simultaneously, the scene direction is more comfortable with silence, using it to build tension between lines, to let the characters sit in their discomfort and disorientation, to give the actors space to emote. There's a scene in both games in which James asks Maria for help opening a fridge. In the original, she playfully mocks him as she helps him. In the remake, there's more of a back and forth. She teases him, pauses, James reacts, then she walks over to help him. The bones of the scene are the same, but there's more of a rhythm to what happens. More time for the viewer to see the shifts in each character's attitude, for their dynamic to play out. The difference in execution helps realize these characters more clearly in the remake. That said, I don't think the remake makes the original obsolete. If you look at each game as a text that can be close read, the original says something different by making its characters be as foggy and off-putting as its setting. The characters and Silent Hill are more closely conjoined. It's hard to see the distinction, or if there even is one. Conversely, the remake fleshes them out in the ways aforementioned, giving the player something to grab onto to wrap their head around. That's not to say they're not unsettling, but it's a bit more understated here, offset by the relatively realistic portrayal. I found the remake's approach more emotionally impactful, but the original still offers its own unique abstract weirdness. Each iteration of Silent Hill 2 uses combat differently to characterize James, which in turn changes his relationship to the player. In the original, a lot of it comes down to the tank controls. James is slow, unresponsive. It often felt like I was fighting the control scheme as much as the enemies. Early in the game, when my only weapon was a wooden plank, I'd have to turn James to face an enemy, go right up to it, and hit it, all while avoiding getting hit by a projectile. There was some room for me to improve, to familiarize myself with enemy movesets and the level's layout and such, but the game resists that, particularly for first-time players like me, by limiting my abilities so strictly. Rather than connecting me to the world, the control scheme maintained some distance, preventing me from fully inhabiting James. I enjoyed that approach. It created an aura of surrealness and mystique, but a large part of its appeal seems abstract to me. By contrast, the remake's appeal came from how it drew me in, how it actually felt to play the game. The camera's over-the-shoulder position, the new ability to dodge, the ability to switch weapons quicker, and in-game controls for things that required a menu in the original brought me much closer to the action and to James. The connection I felt with his character and with the world in turn was stronger. But it didn't take away from the original's core oppressive tone. It's just that now, it turns the atmosphere of numbness and abstract disconnection into concrete, palpable oppression. I felt it in the brutality of melee combat's animations, the fleshy thud of the wooden plank hitting the monsters, and once they fell, how I had to keep hitting them to make sure they'd stay down, James meanwhile yelling in desperation. Although the controls are much more responsive, the enemies are faster and aggressive. The game isn't trying to communicate that James is a skilled fighter. The animations and audio make fights feel frantic, panicked, and exhausting. Although there aren't many enemy types, they put pressure on your vulnerabilities in deceptively simple ways. It didn't take many of them for me to get completely overwhelmed. I think it's worth saying here that I had to bump the difficulty up to hard to really enjoy combat. It felt inconsequential otherwise. I wanted every mistake to be expensive. I'm going to use a particular encounter between James and Pyramid Head to compare each game's approach, so if that sounds like a spoiler to you, go ahead and skip to the next chapter. Just before James leaves the apartments, he enters a room to find Pyramid Head waiting for him. The door locks behind him, and for a few minutes, all the player can really do is stay out of Pyramid Head's reach until he leaves. Attacking him will get him to leave sooner, but it isn't necessary and wastes resources. In the original, the room is tiny. Combine that with the game's stiff, unresponsive movement, and there's very little room for error. So, the encounter turned into me literally moving back and forth from one corner of the room to the other. It would be one thing to do it a few times, but it goes on for a few minutes. A few minutes of doing the exact same thing over and over. By contrast, you essentially do the same thing in the remake, but it doesn't feel like it because you make more decisions more often. The room is bigger. There are objects to get between you and Pyramid Head, and you can dodge his attacks, which incidentally makes melee a more viable approach. Even with all that variability on your side, however, the tension doesn't ease up. It always seems like Pyramid Head is right behind you, like all it would take is one mistake, one instance of getting caught on something in the environment, or timing a dodge poorly, for him to reach you. Although I can't go into detail without really spoiling things, the monotony of the original iteration does contribute something unique to the plot, but I think it's exemplary of how the remake draws out what was so abstract in the original and lets the player experience it more directly. Just as combat characterizes James, the puzzles characterize Silent Hill. Its odd logic, its harrowing symbolism, its recollection of horrors past. They operate on the interplay between past and present, anxieties internal and external, truth and illusion. Throughout the course of the game, I tried to open a box locked by a patient of a psychiatric hospital, put together a broken record to hear what it played without quite knowing why, and followed instructions left specifically for James by some mysterious, seemingly omniscient figure. The fact that the game uses its puzzles to deliver the story is why I think it's okay that on standard difficulty, they were mostly pretty easy. For instance, keys often came with labels telling me exactly what they would open. At one point in the game, I was looking for a 4-number lock combination. I eventually found a document with 4 cryptic lines, each of which very obviously pertained to each number of the combination, and of which every one of the 4 solutions could easily be found in the same room. Sure, I think the game would be better with a greater degree of friction. Some of the highlights for me were when it improved on the more iconic puzzles of the original, like the coin machine and the music box, adding more moving parts and really making me work for the solution. But all of these puzzles don't exist in a vacuum, and their simplicity wasn't a big detriment to my experience of actually playing the game. Like I said, they characterized the setting, but they also played off of one another to stagger my progress, pushing me to move back and forth across the level, making me appreciate every tidbit they provided and using it to advance just a little bit further. Meanwhile, I'm moving through dark hallways, listening for the radio's warning static, and looking out for crouching mannequins to avoid an ambush. Mechanically, the puzzles are pretty simple, and I'd have turned up the difficulty if the game had let me, but when they're supported by all of these other systems, they amount to much more than the sum of their parts. I played the Silent Hill 2 remake on a laptop running an AMD 6800M graphics card, on which its terrible performance blighted an otherwise stellar experience. No matter what settings I chose, the frame rate would often dip below 30. I settled on medium, but even then, the game stuttered all the time, particularly frustrating during combat. And all of this is with upscaling on, by the way, which made a lot of finely detailed textures look grainy or even mushy, which was a shame given how great I think the art direction is. I tried to alleviate the worst aspects of the game's performance with a bit of modding, and although I think I noticed an improvement, slightly better average frame rate, less frequent stuttering, the difference wasn't so obvious that I can say whether I imagined it or not. The game's been updated since I finished it, so it's possible that performance has improved, but the bottom line is still that on my hardware at the time I made my way through it, the game was playable, but in a terrible technical state. It feels bad to leave off on that. If anything, take it as a testament to how much I loved the game that I pushed through its awful performance, and that it was somehow the last thing I think about when I recall my experience. What I actually think about is how each version of this game is made better by the other existing. The old isn't rendered obsolete, and the new is no faithless, soulless cash grab. In both games, you can find a message painted on a wall in a bar. There was a hole here. It's gone now. That's how I see their dynamic. As great as the original is, it was missing something for me, and the remake has come along to offer it, not to one-up the other, not to replace it, but rather to fill that hole. It's a rare thing in video games, for a remake to enhance one's connection to the original, not because either was bad, but because of the fresh understanding it brings, the way it reinterprets and reimagines the source material. Silent Hill 2 Remake is special because it advances what a remake can do, and for that, I think it's a great game. If you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like, and if you want more like this, subscribe and ring the bell. Let me know if there's anything in particular you'd be interested in seeing me cover. I'm thinking of reviewing some newish games like Avowed or last year's Indiana Jones, but as you saw in this video, I'm also into older games. With the Onimusha reboot in the works, it might be fun to play through the old Onimusha games and see what they're all about. Anyway, thanks for watching.